I want to make some introductions of an impressive group to my left. First, I guess Garth Jacobson, just because people, and this is the order I have. Garth, will you raise your hand just so everybody knows? Garth Jacobson, thank you. I pulled this information from their website. These are such impressive credentials. I tried to avoid the subjective stuff. I'm just giving you the objective stuff to just get an idea of the firepower that we've got here. It's very exciting. Garth is a Seattle resident over 20 years, serves as a senior government relations attorney and compliance officer for CT Corporation. He's also been the chief legal counsel to the Montana Secretary of State, served on the Montana Ethics Advisory Commission, served on the Board of Trustees of the State Bar of Montana, was also the president of the Montana First Judicial District Bar Association. Of the many distinctions on the website, the one I picked out was he is a Toll Fellow. I just love that. You don't know what that is. It's a national award that recognizes outstanding leadership and service in state government. He has degrees in economics and philosophy, a law and public administration degree from the University of Montana. His climbing resume includes the summits of Rainier, Mount Hood, Mount Adams, Mount Baker, the Castleton Tower, the Snake Dyke Route on the Half Dome Yosemite. That's Garth Jacobson. Sam Cho, Sam Cho is a lifelong Washingtonian and a son of South Korean immigrants. He was the first in his family to graduate from college. He earned a degree in international relations from the American University and a master's degree from the London School of Economics. After stints at the State Department and as a congressional legislative assistant, Mr. Cho received an appointment from President Obama to work as a special assistant at the GSA, where he worked on agency-wide strategies in real estate management, federal acquisitions, and technology transformation. After the 2016 election, Mr. Cho returned to Washington State and started his own trading company, 7 Seas Export. Last year, he was appointed by Governor Inslee to serve as commissioner on the Washington State Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. That's Sam Cho. Grant Deginger. Grant, by default, I think we know who you are, but he waved his hand. Mr. Deginger is a 5th-generation King County resident with deep roots here. He is the former mayor of Bellevue and an attorney, which personally, I'm an attorney, so I mean, we bonded. It was immediate. Anyway, he is Mr. Deginger helped efforts to bring light rail to the east side, expand transit service, and replace SR 520. After decades of service in Bellevue, he was appointed by Governor Gregoire to the Public Disclosure Commission. I'll say that again because I didn't alliterate it. The Public Disclosure Commission. Serving as chair of that commission cemented his commitment to fairness, transparency, and accountability in both politics and government. Grant is currently the president of Temple de Hirsch Sinai, Reformed Jewish congregation. He serves as the treasurer of Seattle Sports Commission, a public-private partnership that brings major amateur, collegiate, and professional sporting events to the region. Now, I just cherry-pick stuff up. There, go to the websites. I think we can all agree this is an accomplished group. Let's give them a round of applause just to get started. So I am now going to make a final introduction, and that is to our wonderful moderator. And I've got that for Blake Messer right here, and I want to get that right. Blake is actually my best friend. Kind of a running joke. You know, it's a total inside joke. Blake has moderated both divisive and collaborative civic issues over the years on behalf of dozens of chambers of commerce, municipalities, and broadcast enterprises. He now serves the greater Seattle area as the Rotary District 5030 membership chair. His incredible array of civic boards and endeavors, and he gave me a long list, and this is a cut list. Past president of the Rotary of the Des Moines Normandy Park, Washington Rotary, Puget Sound Skills Center Broadcast and Journalism Advisory Board, past president of the Sitka Chamber of Commerce, board member of the Greater Ketchikan Chamber of Commerce, volunteer for Women in Small Biz, Kent Downtown Partnership, Destination Des Moines, and the Des Moines Area Food Bank, advisory board member of the Seattle Taekwondo Foundation, Advisory Board member of the Salvation Army in Alaska, Normandy Park Economic Development Committee. Blake will graciously donate his time, he usually gets paid to do this, on behalf of South King Media in recognition of the importance of local journalism. Please join me in giving Blake a round of applause, and we're going to hand the program over to Blake.
Everybody hear me okay? Okay, some additional Lebowski rules of order here, gentlemen. So let's remain civil, all of us. I know that many of us represent a very influential local coalition, and you gentlemen are vying for position on the commission that might be one of the most important commissions in the Western Hemisphere here tonight. But let's be respectful, let's all play nice. Number two, and this is for the candidates here tonight, I may occasionally ask a yes or no question. You're certainly welcome to prologue that with anything that might support your position on it, but please do answer my yes or no questions. I am relentless and I will circle back on you here, just fair warning. Third one here is time. So when you see Doreen raise that flag, please be respectful of her time. If I say the word time, that means it's time to be done talking for the night. If you, right now would be, not for the night, but just for that question. If you have any objections to any of these additional amended rules, now's the time to object. Objection! Overruled. All right. We found it fair to all concerned. So let's jump right into it here. Steve mentioned at the beginning of this a real hot button issue, START. This is the SeaTac Airport Roundtable. Now, the START, of course, was established as a collaboration between the Port of Seattle, 6 neighboring, including Burien, the FAA, neighboring towns, including Burien, the FAA, Alaska and Delta Airlines, the Port of Seattle has heavily marketed the success of this START program, but these successes have been disputed by a number of START members, and in 3 of the cities representing approximately 75% of the citizens represented by START. The START cities have now suspended, some cities have now suspended their participation in START. Trying to add a little context to a question I'm circling towards here. The triggering act for the suspension appears to be the port's decision to move forward with certain airport expansion plans, specifically $10 million in project design work, without waiting for the results of pending federal and state environmental review, all without any notice to some of these START members. The port has repeatedly apologized for moving forward without notice. However, the port is still moving forward with this expansion work. So my question to you, and we'll go to Mr. Cho first, what is your position on the port moving forward with the elements of its expansion without that environmental review and an opportunity for citizen and city comments?
Well, first, thank you for your time, and thank you for this question. I think it's really important. You know, one of the things that I really want to make sure that we change about the Port of Seattle is that we truly take the input of this community into the decisions we make and not just pay lip service to it, right? I'm aware of studies you're referring to. I believe that the Department of Commerce is obviously doing the study that the state legislature passed. There's a study on fine particles at the University of Washington. I'm a data-driven person, right? So you mentioned that I studied at the London School of Economics. If there's anything that I know is that you need to rely on the data and the facts. And we can't make any informed or right decisions without that. Therefore, as a port commissioner, I will not support any decision that isn't backed up by the data.
Yep. Let's go to Mr. Jacobson next.
Thank you. We'll just hand it down. That sounds good. I think the challenge is this, and that is I feel the pain of projects that seem to go without any sort of analysis, and I really don't like the idea of just kind of giving lip service to those that have opposition. I've been involved in state government in Montana, and I'm aware of the challenges that can occur, but the way it's explained, and that is, I have some real reservations about going forward without doing the necessary analysis prior to moving forward. However, you know, the big however is there's always this huge demand that is out there, and so those two factors weigh against each other. But the short answer is that I would prefer to go through the proper process of analysis before you make expansions.
So I was at the last START meeting because I was trying to do some due diligence and learn a lot more. And I learned of the 3 cities that had suspended the participation. And a couple of things struck me about this. The first was that the port was wrong because the port had promised that it wasn't going to take actions before it talked to the group and to the cities. And it didn't live up to that promise. That's not okay. That's not all right. That's wrong, and it won't happen again, at least if I'm on the Port Commission. There needs to be transparency, and there needs to be, if commitments are made, commitments need to be kept. There is, if I understand it, some data. This was the letting of some contracts for some design work. It wasn't for construction, or it's to look at options. And some of that work may have some value to some things that are important to your organization and that you've listed as important, which is looking at the glide path and how one, what improvements need to be made or changes in airport facilities need to be made in order to facilitate that change that you and your organization have identified as one of the things that need to happen. And if that is valuable, even though it was done incorrectly, and it wasn't, then there may be value in having that work performed. So I want to find out more about that, and if in fact that's part of the menu of things that they're doing to get more data so we can be data driven, and we can also accomplish it, a goal that is identified as something of mutual interest to the airport and to the operators and to the communities, then perhaps there's an opportunity to move that along.
Great. Let's stay on the START topic. Again, this is the sea-tac Airport Round Table. START. How would you advise the cities that have suspended to reform the START program to ensure that the cities and the citizens carry an equal voice at that round table? Let's start with you, Mr. Jacobson.
I think the effort that's always necessary is to get the dialogue going and to basically try to get everyone to somehow understand the problem so that you can in fact get the dialogue happening. And I've been in negotiations before where parties will walk out because of misunderstandings, and sometimes parties will walk out because of the circumstances that may justify walking out of it. But ultimately, the effort should be to try and get that dialogue going again and try to find out where the compromises are that can be made. So that would be my advice, would be to come back and make a major effort to see where the common ground can be found. And then after you reach that point, then figure out how you can deal with the differences.
Let's go to Mr. Deginger.
So I've worked at the federal government level as a congressional staffer. I've worked at the state government as a leader of a commission. But most of my time has been spent as a local government person. So it's important to involve the local governments affected by regional facilities. Whether or not START continues is really up to to you all in the cities that are around there. If there's trust issues and you want to find a different forum to have that, whether it should be the Highline Forum, that's fine. To me, the key is that the issues aren't going away, and we need to have the cities around the table and involved in participating in coming up with ways to address them. So the issues involving that were on the table involving the federal government and the FAA, potential congressional action in some places, other agencies, those all are important issues that need to be followed up on, and they need to have a local role so that the commission can understand what the communities want to see it done, and that we can work arm in arm, because when you want to be effective in DC, you have to have the communities and the port and everybody involved locking arms and going back and trying to get something that they want to get done. That's how you get action and you are successful. Same thing with the noise issues, the noise impact issues. Whether that's the Highline Forum or start or reconstituting start in some other manner that that is more either objective or has a way of making sure that it's not that the trust will be there, I'm fine with that. That is a decision that each of the communities need to make, and I will support it. The key is that we keep the work going.
To Mr. Cho.
You know, I've had the honor and privilege of working on policy and in politics on every level. And if there's anything that I've learned, there's a very famous saying within the political circles. It says, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And my advice to the cities and the people in this community is to get representation. I believe representation matters. And what I'm saying here is that the port needs to reform its elections so that it is districted, so that there is a person in this community that is represented on the port commission, so that there is a constant voice in the ears of the other port commissioners. Because at the end of the day, the problem with this is that you don't have a seat at the table.
All right, let's hold a pause here just for the sake of time, folks. To climate change and flight shaming. Let me unpack this for you. It appears well recognized by all stakeholders, including industry, that aviation is a global major contributor to climate change. New movements have arisen labeled flight shame to highlight the actual reduction in the use of aviation for transportation whenever possible. For instance, KLM, the Dutch airlines, have begun a campaign to try to convince its own consumers to fly less. 16-year-old Greta Thunberg recently brought the movements to the US by sailing across the pond, and she's a phenom and a spokesperson for youth. She was widely quoted as telling world business and political leaders that they need to behave as if our house is on fire. In regards to climate change, first of all, do you believe it's real? Do you believe humans have caused it? And I'll let Mr. Deginger start.
I not only believe it's real, I actually signed the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement when I was mayor of Bellevue and led an effort by our city to get very involved in developing a sustainability plan and reducing our carbon footprint. So the answer is not only yes, but hell yes. I believe it's a crucial issue. No doubt about it. And I also think that from the standpoint of what's going on with the port has taken this to heart and has really adopted one of the most aggressive goals of being the greenest port in the United States, and has set some aggressive goals for sustainability both in the seaport and at the airport. So a lot needs to be done. It's not one silver bullet, not one thing that needs to be done. It's a variety of things that need to be done. That involves reducing the carbon footprint of the airport, reducing emissions in and around the airport, supporting development of a biofuels industry. One of the things that they've identified in the master plan that I do support is building a tank for biofuels and helping to support the development of a biofuels industry. None of those things alone are going to get us to the promised land. It has to be a whole lot of things. And moreover, there has to be developments in technology, improving technology, lower emission aircraft, quieter aircraft. Lots of things that we need to do. Our challenge that we have here is we are a growing region, and we have to figure out a way of making sure that we can do our part and reduce our climate footprint, our carbon footprint at the airport and in all transportation modes. The airport is a big transportation center, and it needs to do its part.
Let's go to Mr. Cho next.
Yes, I absolutely believe in climate change. I'll tell you a story. When I was a legislative assistant in Congress, we were working on appropriations, and there was a bill that would have basically updated and upgraded our weather satellites. And the conservative Republicans blocked that bill to upgrade our weather satellites. Can anyone guess why? Because those satellites also do research on climate change. They keep track of climate, right? So the reality is that we are facing an uphill battle here. I believe that the port has an outsized role in tackling climate change. We have the largest carbon footprint of any government entity in the state. I believe that we need to start transitioning to sustainable sources of energy. I'm talking about electrification, installing preconditioned air at our gates so that those planes aren't running their engines while they're sitting there on the tarmac. I believe that we need to look at biofuels, I think is a big one. But I also think that hybrid planes will make a huge difference in the near term. And I'll tell you why. We're talking about air pollution, but we also, for this community especially, noise pollution, right? And hybrid planes offer an interesting solution because if you have a hybrid plane, you can use the electricity for takeoff and landing, right? And that will not only reduce emissions, but it's actually a lot quieter. So I believe hybrid planes are a very near-term solution. Airbus just announced a hybrid plane that they plan to bring online in the next 5 years. I don't know what Boeing's doing. They're still dealing with the MAX 8 crisis. But I think that we need to start putting our money where our mouth is. Start putting our money into the research and development of the next generation, the future of aviation. Because we have to admit, aviation isn't going anywhere. We just need to put our money into the research to make sure that aviation becomes sustainable in the future.
Mr. Jacobson.
Well, I think we're in unanimous agreement here, and I can't imagine anyone in the audience not agreeing that climate change is a problem. Obviously, on today's latest news, the walkout plan for tomorrow, and so on and so on, by the next generation that is most going to be impacted by this. I think, there's certain things that got me excited about running for the port, and one of the things, other than the fact that I'm probably in agreement as to the problems that the airport has caused, or at least for those that are going through it and to it, and so on and so on, and I'll get to that if there's an appropriate question. But one of the issues that I think is most important, and that is, what is the port doing? Now, last fall, the port raised your taxes, property taxes that is, for the purpose of building, in part, the purpose of building a new terminal for cruise ships. And I don't know if any of you are aware of this, but cruise ships, they produce 3 to 4 times more pollution per passenger mile than airplanes. And so what is happening here is that the port, on one hand, is making efforts to try and reduce pollution. On the other hand, they're doing something where they're actually going to be increasing pollution by promoting an activity that, according to the New York Times and Forbes magazine, which is not exactly a conservative, it's not exactly a bastion of liberal comment, they believe that the cruise ship industry is going to be reduced because of the fact that people are going to be much more concerned about pollution and the travel activities. So I would say we do not go forward with that new terminal at this time.
Next question. Many critics state that aviation's pointing to biofuels is flawed because, number one, it's not now available. Number two, it may be technically not feasible. And number three, it won't make a dent if it is. Second part of this question is involving aviation with climate change. Do you believe that aviation is a major contributor to this? And let's start with Sam.
I would argue that aviation is probably one of the biggest contributors to this. But to your point about biofuel, I have my skepticism over biofuel. And the reason is this. How this works, whatever fuel you use when it comes to sustainability, the term sustainability means it needs to be neutral, carbon neutral, right? So the idea is that whatever you input into creating that fuel can exceed or be below the output, right? My problem with biofuel is, one, I'm skeptical as to whether or not the energy that we actually put into making biofuels is really on net reducing carbon. But secondly, what I've research shows that biofuels is not cheaper than normal fuels, and therefore no one's incentivized to use biofuels. So this is why I talk about electrification and hybrid more, because I believe that that is a far more feasible and more practical idea than going to biofuels. I do think that biofuels is a bit of a red herring. I have not seen data yet to see whether or not it's feasible. A lot of people have talked about it, but it needs to make sense. Again, the data needs to be there to support the decision to use biofuels. And right now, the cost of using biofuels and the process of creating biofuels, and the technology is not there yet.
I'm trying to recall exactly how the question was phrased, but obviously I believe that airplanes certainly contribute greatly to the issues of climate change, and there's no question about it. I'm probably one of those guilty for having a terrible carbon footprint because I travel a lot and I fly a lot. And there's kind of a yin-yang sort of thing here, and that is that I really think that we need to greatly reduce the amount of travel that we do because of the carbon footprint. But on the other hand, there's a lot to be said by getting to other places, especially traveling to other countries, meeting people, connecting with people. When you have meetings that are online by Skype or whatever, you oftentimes fail to really get the feel, just as if you're not in a room like this looking at people and connecting, you really miss out. So what are we going to do? I guess the answer is there will be technology changes that will probably help. I was quizzing a friend of mine who is a Boeing engineer last night about all his thoughts and recommendations in this area. But I think the technology is probably not going to get us there in the short run. In the long run, we'll probably be looking at things such as high-speed trains and other alternative forms of transportation that would probably make some of the concerns that you have right now somewhat moot. But to get back to it, yeah, it is a problem. I'm not sure there's a quick answer to it, and it troubles me just like it troubles you.
Mr. Deginger?
Well, certainly aviation is a source of climate change or is a contributing factor. And I would agree that we and the people that live in this community have a lot at stake in coming up with solutions. I believe, certainly the Boeing company is going to be part of that solution, and the people who work for Boeing here will be part of the solution in developing aircraft that are either hybrid or use a whole lot less fuel. In terms of biofuels, it may be a transitional fuel to get us to that. It may be part of that transition to get from where we are today to either hybrid or electrified aircraft. But it's worth, sometimes when you're trying to advance things, you have to try some new things, and this is also worth a try. The port alone isn't going to create a market for biofuels. It's whether it can provide support enough to test and see if this is an alternative that has staying power both economically and environmentally in terms of the carbon footprint it takes to develop it. So we will see, and I think the port has been willing to and should every once in a while take a look and see if those kind of alternatives may work.
Next two-part question. At a time when much of the world wants to see less aviation, the port seems to be full speed ahead with mammoth growth plans. Do you think that's responsible? Question number one. Question number two, the port often claims that it's only responding to demand, but the port markets to potential flyers and businesses relentlessly, and markets to bring in new airlines to sea-tac. Is this responding to demand? Do you think this is responsible? Let's start with Mr. Deginger.
A lot of what the port is responding to is the tremendous growth that this region's had. I think all of us that have lived here, how many of you have lived here for more than 5 years? How about more than 10 years? How about more than 15 years? Last one, more than 20 years. So the majority of us know that we've experienced a great deal of growth here in this region. And the port, in terms of the airport and the services, the access in and out of the airport and the services provided in the airport and the terminal itself, has not kept up with that demand and kept up with that in terms of its infrastructure, its own infrastructure. So even if there was no further growth today, work needs to be performed to make what we have today work today. And we also know that with the PSRC, which is the Puget Sound Regional Council, just came out with its Vision 2050. They're expecting a whole lot more people here. And I think the fact of the matter is, at least the data that's available and done by the experts who do these studies for all levels of government are agreeing that we are likely to continue to see a fair amount of growth. Whether the rate of growth will be as exponential as it is today, that may change with economic circumstances and the economy, but the fact of the matter is, I think we do have to plan for additional growth, and I think that there is a need to address some long, non-addressed problems at the airport in terms of its footprint and in terms of its, the work that, the access in and out, the impact it has on neighboring communities, and also the terminal. The lines are too long. It's difficult to get in and out and get to gates.
Mr. Cho next.
You know, on the campaign trail, I talk a lot about making sure that the Port of Seattle is working for the people of Seattle. And I think that the Port of Seattle has been run way too much like a corporation as opposed to a government entity. And I think when it comes to growth, we need to start thinking about how we can spread some of that growth. I think the idea of, oh, we're responding to demand, again, is a corporate idea, right? The idea of we are growing, but we should also spread it to the other areas, right? One of the ideas that I talk about a lot on the campaign trail is offloading some of the cargo shipments to Moses Lake, right? Because the reality is that those cargo shipments are not only really loud, but also we just don't have all the capacity for cargo. As an exporter, when I export something out of Washington, a lot of it comes from Eastern Washington. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense for me to export a bunch of cherries, truck them all the way over to the other side of the state to fly them out. We can fly them out of Moses Lake, and it would cut down on, truck emissions, but it will also cut down on the number of flights coming in here. But I think one point that I really want to make here, since we're talking about growth, is that growth does not necessarily equal quality of life. And this is a huge distinction that I really want to emphasize here. That a lot of times when we talk about economic growth and growth, we assume that when growth happens, the quality of life goes up. But in this community especially, you all know that growth has had an inverse relationship with your quality of life. Because the growth of sea-tac Airport has hurt your quality of life. So I just want to make it clear that I understand this. I've heard this from so many stakeholders in this community. And as a port commissioner, one of the things that I intend to do is make sure that the port is working for the people and that it is working towards improving your quality of life.
Mr. Jacobs.
Well, the reasons that one of the primary reasons I'm running for this position is because I'm extremely frustrated with the airport and how it's growing. And I think the fact is that they're driving in front of their headlights, so to speak. I might clarify that I'm not running against these two other really good people. I'm running against a guy who's not here. I'm sure he has many things going on and he couldn't make it. But basically, I'm running against what the port is right now because I think it needs to be better. And that's where I really have problems with what the port has done. I mean, for example, going to the airport, it's a horror show. If you're driving there, I mean, it takes forever, it seems like, to find parking. And then getting through the TSA lines, it's all miserable. And it's because it has grown too fast. Or it either has grown without the thought of how to grow. My sister's a flight attendant, and she tells me that they used to, just fly straight into sea-tac. Now they serpentine back and forth to delay the flight getting in so that they can line up. That's all a sign that they have too many planes trying to come in to the airport at this point, and they didn't plan for that, and they just simply did it. That is, a very irritating thing if you're trying to get to the airport and if you're trying to get away from the airport or anything else. I think the problem is this, and that we're sinking in our own success. The area has been very successful and we haven't really dealt with it, and that's something that has to be done. Or you might say, like Yogi Berra said, nobody goes there because it's too crowded.
All right, Mr. Cho mentioned quality of life. Let's go to that in the next question here. What is quality of life as it relates to airport neighbor communities? There's been a fair amount of controversy about the term quality of life as it appears in the port's mission and to the ongoing study related to aviation impacts. The port removed the phrase quality of life from its mission statement in 2017, and just recently added it back earlier this month. My question is, what do you believe is a fair expectation by airport neighbor citizens about quality of life? And let me add an extra one to that. Do you believe an airport neighbor citizen must sacrifice quality of life because of geographic proximity? Start with you, Sam.
So I was at that Port Commission meeting when they voted on that amendment to the mission and added economic growth and quality of life. So for the first time, they basically made a distinction between economic growth and quality of life, which is what I was alluding to in my last answer. I think every person in King County has a right to quality of life, regardless of where you live. I think that it is our duty as elected officials, as people who represent you, the constituents, to promote quality of life. I mean, honestly, what are we doing if we are not promoting quality of life for people? Like, why are we running for office? What is public service? It's serving the public, right? So why is this not our number one priority as elected officials? It baffles me sometimes how these incentives get perverted when we become elected officials, and I hope to be a difference here. But when it comes to quality of life, what does that mean? I mean, some really basic stuff, like being able to sleep through the night without being woken up by planes, right? Being able to open your windows, and not be affected by the noise pollution, right? Not being affected by the fine particles that our airplanes are, emitting. The reality is that we have a bunch of problems here that we need to solve, but just like any other problem, in order to solve it, we need to admit that there is a problem, and then we need to all agree on where we're going. And as a port commissioner, I hope to change the conversation from a conversation about how can we get more airlines into the port and talk more about how can we improve the lives of the people who are living in the area.
Let's go to Grant next.
So this is a topic that is very, very important. This may be the hardest question that I face as your next port commissioner, because I think we need to do more here. I've talked a lot on the campaign trail that the port needs to be a better neighbor. I've been a mayor and I've been a city council member and had to deal with the impacts of regional facilities coming into your community and how to mitigate those impacts. And there's, and although some of those facilities are big, none of them compares to the airport. Here, I think there's been a real failure to address mitigation effectively to improve the quality of life here. And that has happened in a number of regards. There's been a lack of creativity in how mitigation is addressed, and it's been so limited. The notion somehow that you can't have soundproof, be qualified for the soundproofing program if your house was built after 1987, 30 plus years ago, is ridiculous. We've got to get that changed so that we can help improve the quality of life in this community by addressing some of those problems. Two, we also have to address the fact that you should be able to sleep through the night. We've got to work at reducing these aircraft flights late at night. We've talked about that. I know that's been a subject that's been ongoing, but it needs to continue to be ongoing. The other part is environmentally. We need to see that there's exceptional mitigation in terms of providing open space and park space and land that will help improve air quality here too. The tree canopy in these communities. There's a lot of things that can be done. The menu seems to be very, very narrow, and we need to do a better job of it so that, if there are regional impacts from the regional organization and from the communities around here, the communities all over the county that benefit by having the airport, we need to help mitigate the impacts right here where they're felt the most.
Mr. Jacobson.
I think one of the things that often gets forgotten are the impacts or the unintended consequences with the activities associated with the port. I go back to my aunt who, well, she's passed now, but she was a school teacher here for almost 50 years, lived in West Seattle, and she was a school teacher at a school that got gobbled up by the airport. It was a school that was in the way of a runway, and hence it was eliminated. And her quality of life at that time was going to the school with a relatively short commute from West Seattle, and she had all these students that lived nearby, and they all got relocated or dislocated or whatever happened to them, because obviously the school was taken out for a new runway. And the whole process of that is extremely painful. And I think we all talk about progress, and we all talk about how important it is to grow, to become the greatest, or whatever it might be. And yet we forget these painful moments that occur when we do grow at a rate that is just beyond what we can handle. I'm not saying you can't grow, and I'm not saying you can't do that, but I'm saying that there are some real personal consequences. And I know when my aunt, her school closed, and she had to, basically go into the process of finding a new place to teach, it was a painful process for her. And all I can say is that the port must be mindful of the pain they create when they grow.
Okay, thank you. Next question will focus on the science of noise and emissions. Last year, the World Health Organization released new 2018 environmental noise guidelines. The report reviewed global science since 2009 and provided specific recommendations for the immediate need to reduce aircraft noise, especially at night. The guidelines identify adverse health effects, including hypertension, cardiovascular disease, annoyance, cognitive impairment, and sleep deprivation. The World Health Organization report makes it clear that the guidelines are intended to have global relevance and are based upon evidence derived from studies in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the United States. World Health Organization states that these guidelines are a comprehensive and robust plan underpinned by evidence and served as a sound basis for action. To date, nearly 1 year later, despite frequent public comment, despite resolutions from the city of Burien and requests from the cities of Des Moines and Federal Way, despite inclusion of the 5th POSANC Accord, the port has taken no action in response to the World Health Organization report. Mr. Cho, we'll start with you again. Here's how you responded to a direct question in the league questionnaire about that World Health Organization guidelines. The Port of Seattle, as well as neighboring cities and municipalities, should form a coalition to advocate on behalf of adopting noise policy guidelines. This means lobbying the Federal Aviation Administration and members of Congress as they regulate flight paths away from residential neighborhoods, raise the flight altitude above 3,000 feet, and increase the glide slope of planes. Mr. Cho, just for clarification, are you in favor of the lower World Health Organization guidelines? Why or why not? And for the other panelists here tonight, please answer that same question. We'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm definitely in favor of some of those guidelines, and as well as some of the ideas to mitigate the noise pollution and just pollution in general. I think we are in a precarious situation given that the FAA controls a lot of these regulations and policies, but I do think that the port commissioners have a duty to voice the concerns of this community to the federal government, to Congress, and that's why I put that in the answer. Everything from the glide slope, which I mentioned in my answer, but also the radius within which planes can lower their landing gears, even like exploring, the curfews on the 3rd runway. I mean, these are all things that I hope to make sure that we bring to the table and advocate for. The reality is that we need to be responsible for the actions we need to keep the federal government responsible, right? And so everything from, I had a chance to talk to a few folks about the Green Skies Initiative and Next Gen, and all these things that kind of just fell off, right? I think it's our job as port commissioners to hold the federal government responsible for what they're doing, and I look forward to doing that as a port commissioner.
All right, Mr. Jacobson, you're next.
We keep having cord problems here. Sorry about that. Admittedly, I am not personally familiar with the guidelines per se, but I do travel a lot, and I've been to many different airports, some of which impose noise pollution protections. I mean, for example, John Wayne Airport in California, obviously Orange County, or maybe not obvious, but it is in Orange County. They have a requirement that the planes take off fast, and then they feather their engines until they get over the ocean, and then they are able to go from there. Now, it kind of raises a question to me, which is maybe a social economic question, and that is that for an airport as busy as John Wayne to do that, it would suggest to me that probably what happened is there's a lot of the neighborhoods near the airport, or relatively near the airport, are fairly high income neighborhoods. And I wonder if there would be different things happening if it were, you know, if it were perceived that it was high-income areas. I'm not to disparage anyone here, because I know, but I'm just wondering if the conversation would be different. And so I think what needs to be done is the conversation needs to change, and the value of everybody needs to be imposed. And we need to be thinking about what they do in John Wayne Airport, where they do protect, you know, there is noise reduction there. Or Sydney, Australia, where they have a limit as to when planes can take off and when they can land. And in that case, what you're ending up with is a situation where, you know, if you don't land that plane by a certain time or take off after a certain time, you get greatly fined.
Mr. Deginger.
So my understanding is, and I'm not an expert on noise levels, but I've been reading and learning about these studies. And my understanding is that the port and the cities were signing on to a letter together to the delegation to ask them to take some action in Washington. And moreover, my understanding is that we have some key congressional delegation members that are members of their respective appropriations committee. And things have changed in Washington, but one of the things that hasn't changed is what gets funded gets done. And my understanding is they're asking our delegation to work to have the appropriate, when the FAA's, when its agency appropriations are addressed, to have them be required to study what they're doing and analyze the World Health Organization's conclusions and provide some guidance on what they like about it, what we could do with it, and provide a baseline, some data that we could use then to have applied in the federal with the FAA and with the local port authorities. So I think that's a really important step. I want to see it done. A lot of what we have to do sometimes is go back there and go back locked arm in arm, you know, as the port and the cities, and work hard with our delegation to get some of these things done. And this is a place where I think we can be effective.
My last question here before I turn it over to the crowd. In this, we'll start with Mr. Jacobson. This is just a yes or no response, but I appreciate it if you keep it under 30 seconds. Curfews, controversial. Communities want them, industries want to fly at night. Are you in favor of curfews? Yes or no?
I think curfews would be preferable, but I can think of exceptions, such as some flight delay that would, you know, cause a plane to not be able to come. But I think, in general, yes, there should be curfews.
Yep, Mr. Deginger.
So my understanding is we, the Port Commission, don't get to decide that. I would like to continue to work with the airlines to reduce the number of flights at night. But I'm not going to tell you that we have the power to do it. I'm not going to tell you something that I know we don't have the power to do. I know that we can work very hard to put a lot of pressure on the customers as well as on the agencies to give us some tools to do a better job of reducing flights at night.
Okay. Mr. Cho.
So my understanding is also that the FAA regulates this, but I am in favor of stopping cargo flights on the third runway for sure. And so I think that is an area where we do have control and an area where I think we can make progress.
Thank you. I'll circle back on that third runway issue here in just a second. Let's turn it over to the crowd and the roaming mic.
Good evening. My name is Rob Harmon. I'm a resident of Vashon Island. In 2012, the environmental impact assessment completed by the FAA stated that noise levels on Vashon would not exceed 45 dBl under next gen. We believe that the noise levels significantly exceed that. Since July of 2018, we've been asking the port to install 2 noise monitors on Vashon. To date, that item has never appeared on a port agenda. Do you support the installation of noise monitors on Vashon, and will you request that it be put to a vote at the first board meeting you attend?
All right, let's go with Sam. You start this one out.
Yes, I do support the idea of putting noise monitors on Vashon. And actually, I think Vashon should be included in the Department of Commerce study as well, and also Beacon Hill. There's a lot of neighborhoods that were not included in that Department of Commerce study, and so I'd actually like to go back to the state legislature and include some of those communities so that we have the data.
Mr. Deginger.
I agree that we need to have noise monitors at a number of other locations, Vashon and some other communities where we've heard concerns about noise. So the answer would be yes. Exactly where? We need to do some more study to be exactly sure. Where else?
I'll keep my answer short, yes.
Okay. All right, next question.
Hi, I'm Kent Polisari from sea-tac. This is Kai. We're going next just because he's kind of lost his patience for this. So what's near and dear to me is children's health. I don't know if you know that there's a park here in sea-tac where residents you can't build houses there, but kids can play. I've talked to different educators around here about the pollution problem. And one said the other day, well, it's a good thing we don't let the kids go out and play much. So when you're talking about quality of life, I'm afraid to let my kids play outside. By the way, in our research in finding particulates, it's worse inside, right? Because it just stays there, there's no wind. So really, there's not a safe place when it comes to nanoparticles. What Greta was saying is we have to think in terms of our hair being on fire. You need to be more aggressive in your 5-year plan. Like, what are we going to do right now? Is it safe for us to live here right now? What I'm frustrated with is, well, in 10 years or 20 years, we'll have the problem solved. Okay, my child grows up in that environment for 20 years. The solution people have been giving me is you should move, Ken. All right, but you see the moral implications of that. I can move, what about everybody else? That's not the answer. Right, Kai? And so, one of the things that I want is, and I'm encouraged by what you guys have been saying, one of the things I want us to see is more cooperation. You see those signs like drive like your kids live in the neighborhood? I want you guys to act like your kids live here. When you talk about being a good neighbor, last year my daughter and I walked 12 miles to the port of Seattle. And during that time, turns out I developed an aneurysm. Okay, so right now, my quality of life is, as long as I don't exert myself, I'll be okay. So my question is, what is your aggressive plan? What are you going to do in the next 5 years to help our quality of life?
Let's start with Mr. Cho.
You know, I have to admit, I'm not from South King County, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I've lived what you've lived through. But I will say that I hear you, I empathize with you, and I want to work with you. Right? I think what's important here, and I've emphasized this earlier, is that it's important for you all to have a seat at the table. To make sure that you're not giving lip service at these START meetings or the Highline Forum, fine, that's, optically that's fine. But if you want to talk about making sure that, your voice is heard, that there's real change, I think in the next 5 years, what we need is representation. And so one thing that I promised as a candidate, but also port commissioner, is to really push to make sure that you get representation on the port by districting it. I've been saying this, not just here, I've been saying it throughout the entire campaign. You can check me on this. This is an issue that, I've felt really strongly about. I've talked to legislators about this, people like Mia Gregerson and Karen Kaiser, Mike Policiotti. I think that is probably the biggest thing that we can do to make sure that you have representation on the port.
Okay, let's go to Garth next.
Well, I look out in the crowd here and I'm thinking, I wish someone else would have run instead of me. Because you know, it's a painful process, and anyone that ever gets involved in this recognizes that it's not a matter of district so much as it is just getting people energized to do this effort. That doesn't answer the question you asked. I think, you know, I think the first step is to be aware of the problem. And I spent a fair amount of time last night with my climbing partner, who's a Boeing engineer, and we started talking about this because this topic is important to me. And I said, so what can be done, and what are you aware of? And he said, well, you know, when I was playing soccer, and he used to play soccer in different places, and he said he was in a park down by the airport, and I'm not sure which soccer field it is, but anyway, he said, I didn't realize the weird noises that those planes make when they come down. And he was explaining the vortex noise that the plane creates, this whoop, whoop, whoop sound. And it was something that I was not aware of, and he, as a Boeing engineer, was not aware of it until he actually played soccer on a field right next to the airport. So I think the first commitment that I would make is to spend some time in the area to see what those problems are. You know, how is it going to feel? What can be done? I think there needs to be a total sensitivity towards the problems that occur. And I think a lot of times people who get elected to office, they fail to really get on the ground and spend time with the people who are most affected by the decisions they make. So I would make that commitment to you and then try to do my best to figure out ways to mitigate the challenges you face.
And to Grant.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. Clearly, as I said earlier, this is the hardest. These noise and quality of life issues in the neighborhoods around here are going to be the hardest issues we face. We face some big decisions at the airport from, you know, facility-wise, but these are hard. And I think that I agree with you. You can't wait, and I don't think you should, because I think there are programs that the port can do now to help mitigate some of these issues. Not all of them, but I think we could do a better job and a better good faith effort to do so. I mentioned a couple of them earlier. We have got to make it easier for people to get their houses soundproof. The fact that they've only done 9 houses this year in that program is ridiculously low. I mean, that's just unacceptable. So we've got to check, we've got to revise the standards, and if we have to go to Washington, we have to go to Olympia, we will do it and work hard to do that so that more homes can receive that soundproofing, and that you're not one and done, or if your house was built after 1987, you can't participate. That's just not right. We need to do more in terms of helping, you know, if we can reduce the impacts through some things in the community, park-wise, tree canopy-wise, other things that we can do to help improve the quality of life. That's just a small list of things. There are other things that we've talked about here in terms of airport operations and the like, but I think we need to improve the mitigation, to have just mitigation, but make it much more exceptional mitigation. I think anytime when you have a big public facility near you and the public benefits from that, there's an obligation that goes with that to mitigate as much as possible the impacts. Thank you.
Yeah. We got one right over here. I'll throw a quick little 30-second softball at all of you guys, and we'll start with Grant here. Just an addendum to that gentleman's question. You know, a lot of people that live here in South King County that are concerned about noise and emission and aircrafts flying over are told if you don't like it, you should move. Or you move next to an airport, what did you expect? Is this fair? And how would you respond to somebody in this area?
I think that's cruel. It's not fair, and I think what we need to do is do a better job. As I say, the airport has grown, the region has grown, and as a result, the impact of the airport is not the same as it was when many of you moved here. We have to do a better job of mitigating those impacts. That's all there is to it. We have to do better, and if I'm elected, we will do better.
Let's go to Sam next here, and Garth, you'll back cleanup.
I mean, I don't think it's fair because no one here can predict the future. You know, when we took that straw poll of people who moved here 20 plus years ago, there's no way that anyone could have predicted that King County was going to grow this much, that the sea-tac airport was going to grow this much, that this was going to be a problem. And so I think that, when it comes to that comment about, well, why don't you just move? Well, how can you move when your property values are going down due to the problem, right? That doesn't make sense to me, right? So I think it is cruel. I think that we need to take into consideration that, some people are stuck, right? Maybe you do want to move, but you can't, because you can't sell your house to afford a house somewhere else in the county where it's even more expensive, right? And so I firmly reject that notion. I think that it has no place in this discussion, and that we need to start pivoting that discussion from why don't you move, why don't you not live there, to how can we better facilitate a quality of life for you all.
Well, when you get into property questions, I start, my legal mind starts rattling around thinking, okay, there's all the legal issues involved in that. I'm sure Grant would, have the same thoughts about nuisance, those issues related to that. Okay, you wouldn't, well, anyway, at least I know the legal arguments. But I think the problem is this, and that is that when you apply those the theories that, you move there and that's what you get, the problem is that when the conditions change so greatly that it wasn't the same as when you first moved there, there's a significant difference there. And I think that's the problem. I mean, the growth has been tremendous in the last decade, well, after the recession, if you want to call it that, from 2010 on, it's just been incredible, and you guys know that more than I do. But the fact is that wasn't, I got the sign. Anyway, I would say it's a problem, and it needs to, it's not fair to you.
Great. Question from the audience.
Yes, hi. Thanks for coming tonight, and I appreciate the time you're taking to answer our questions carefully. Anyway, my name is Sharon Parker, and I'm with the Burien Quiet Skies Coalition, and I'm also on the Burien Airport Committee. And prior to my retiring in 2015, I was the noise officer at King County International Airport for 14 years. So I know FAA regulations. I know the port's culture, and you don't have to go as far as Olympia or Washington, D.C. to have these changes made. All you have to do is just drive right over to SeaTac Airport and talk to the port commissioners. They're in control now, and you'll find out many of these issues could be resolved right now, particularly mitigation, because I managed a sound insulation program for 6 years at Boeing Field. And in those 6 years, we did 600 homes. I just recently read the internal audit by the port of the SeaTac's sound insulation program, and they patted themselves on the back for getting 40 done in 3 years. They are so behind, and in the meantime, people are suffering the noise. A lot of the outrage, a lot of the volume on that outrage could be turned way down. But let me give you 2 examples. One is that they were given authority by the FAA in 2014 to move forward on the implementation of their Part 150 2013-2018 noise plan. That plan, I'll put an asterisk, was only for the 3rd runway. The last noise analysis they did was in 2002. That's how many years ago? I can count, but so can you. And that means there are hundreds, possibly thousands, of homes that have not been mitigated because they haven't done a recent noise study. We keep bringing it up. We brought it up at our Burien Airport Committee. Stan Shepard says, oh, we can't do it until 2021, until after the SAMP stuff. So while they're ramping up, moving from 14th busiest airport in the country to the 8th busiest airport in the country, all these people are having to endure the noise while they sit and do nothing in terms of updating their noise analyses. And what that means is that when even after they did the Part 150 in 2013 to 2018, they got the funding in June 2014 to do the homes. There's like 200 condos. They didn't hire a contractor until October 2018, 4 years later. There's no excuse for that. There is absolutely no excuse for waiting that many years to actually hire the contractor. I read the internal audit. There are cost overruns all over the place. They have a little group at the very tippy top of the port that meets quarterly to supervise the contractors. Let me tell you, if you had somebody in your kitchen remodeling, you couldn't wait a quarter, 3 months for somebody to resolve an issue. It is so out of control, it is unbelievable. So I would like you gentlemen to please promise that you will sit down with us and we can give you that, not only the anecdotal history, but I did some research on behalf of our coalition and others collaborated with me. It's a 15-page, you like facts and you like analysis, you like data, dating back to the noise expert review panel that was commissioned by WSDOT and PSRC in the early 90s. And in that document, their final report, they bring up time and time and time again, all the same things. There are quotes in there, I could share this document with you if you want it, that talk about, well, geez, you could have gotten 2,000 more homes done if you'd done X, Y, and Z. So they knew back in '96 that they were trailing the demand, and still nothing has changed. The issues that they're taking up at START are the same frickin' issues that are in that. The question is, will you promise to meet with us and to follow through? Because this has been going on for 27 years, dating back to the third runway. And why haven't they done noise analyses? They pat themselves on the back and yet it isn't happening.
Gentlemen, 30 seconds here on mitigation of noise analysis and respond to her comments.
Well, the answer is yes. I will be here, and I have been here, and I think I've shown that. But I think you've touched on a pressure point that goes beyond mitigation packages, and that is accountability at the port. The reality is when we talk about transparency and accountability, we like to think about it in terms of the Port Commission and the constituents, but what we really need is accountability between the port commissioners and the senior executives at the port who are supposed to be carrying out what you're talking about right now. And so as a port commissioner, one of the things that I talk about when it comes to accountability is keeping the senior executives at the port accountable. And I hope to do that by making some changes by hiring staff for the port commissioners so they can actually keep track of what's going on there.
Okay, let's go to Garth next.
My undergraduate degree is in economics, and one of the one of the concepts in economics is that you internalize externalities, which is a way of saying, if you're making money off of a product that causes harm to others, then you have to mitigate that harm that you're causing to others, such as pollution. You need to, pay for the people that are harmed by it. And so I would say that, the airport really needs to be a better neighbor and to, step up to the plate and do what it needs to do to internalize the externalities.
Mr. Jacobson, would you be willing to sit down, as she asked?
Oh, of course I would. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's more than sitting down. I think it's spending some time underneath the runways and everything else, yes.
Well, I would agree, Sharon. I think I said at the beginning, before we started our session, that this isn't the last conversation, it's the first conversation, and I really mean that. I believe that if we're going to have an exceptional airport and we're going to make investments in this exceptional airport, we need to have exceptional mitigation of the impacts of the airport. And as I've said in prior answers, we can do much better, we can deliver more improvements much faster. And that's what astounded me when I was at the state meeting. I know you were there at that meeting, and I was just astounded at how little had been accomplished in such a long period of time. My background's in construction, and also I remember being participating in the 2002 study. So that's an option as well as to on how another study.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. There are about 1 billion passengers in the United States traveling per year now. There's about 10 million flights per year commercial airlines flight per year, and it's going to increase. The rate is about 10% per year. We've seen extraordinary growth all around our country. We have very smart people on the port, very smart people in the FAA, very smart airport folks, all working to increase capacity, increase efficiency. So the realistic thing that's going to happen is that the overall average noise, if nothing else is going to be done, is going to increase. That increases particulates, that increases noise pollution and pollution dropping on our heads every day at a 10% rate per year, and there's no stopping it if we continue to be better, more efficient, and increase capacity. I will say when one looks out to Europe, one sees that the cruise industry is going for a zero carbon budget. Large cities know that we are already up to a point where it's reducing the quality of life for those major cities. There are 20,000 people a year coming into ports, and for the people living there, it's no longer acceptable. So they are forcing the cruise industry to go zero carbon. The cruise industry is stepping up. The cruise industry is going to go all electric in and out of the ports. The idea of hybrid transportation for planes is extraordinarily ripe for working. What we need to do is link and have a rule. So if you want to increase capacity, if you want to land at our airports, you need to meet certain rules, and you need to come in with a much lower carbon budget. We don't care how you do it. You just need to do it. And that needs to be something, and my question is, will you support locally and nationally to continue to elevate that so that we can get those sort of rules in place?
Let's go to Garth first.
Well, I might start by saying I appreciate listening more than I want to speak, and I like your introduction to the question because it expresses things that I think are important, and I wish this were a listening session instead of a session where up there we're talking. But my quick answer is yes, I would support that.
Okay. To Grant.
I'm intrigued by it. I don't know as much as I need to know about it. One of the things about running for office and actually after being elected is, everybody thinks you know it all. You're learning all the time. I mean, I did this for 12 years as elected. I will learn, I will study it, I will learn more about it. It's intriguing me that, that kind of a solution is something that we need to look at.
Mr. Cho.
Yes, absolutely. I think we need to elevate this conversation though, so that it transcends not just the Puget Sound, but regionally as well, making sure that everyone in this region is all on board. Because the reality is that if we're the only ones doing it, it's not going to make a huge impact. They can just go somewhere else and pollute, right? So the solution is to make sure that we're doing it all together. But also another thing that you touched upon is making sure that we're encouraging the use of alternative modes of transportation. Things like high-speed rail, bullet trains, I know we have Hyperloop, right? Some of these alternatives that we have, we need to make sure we look into.
Well, we're queuing up our next question. I'll go back to port mitigation. There are claims by many homeowners that their port sound installation mitigation packages are now failing or have failed. In other words, the windows and the doors and the insulation is allegedly failing. It's also alleged that the contractors who performed some of that work that she was talking about earlier are now out of business. And those homeowners were required to sign waivers of any future relief in order to receive those initial noise packages. To date, neither the port nor the FAA, the entities that received all of the airspace rights in benefit for the exchange of the waivers, have offered any relief. State Representative Tina Orwell is now collecting information about these claims. Now, what do you think the Port of Seattle should do to help these homeowners? Let's start with Grant, please. 30 seconds.
Yeah, this is something that really bothers me because, yeah, they had to sign and provide an easement, and the issue is, otherwise it's a gift of public funds or something like that. And I think we can solve it. We may need the legislature to change the law a little bit, but 30 years later, look at things are going to fail. I mean, these are this isn't a one and done situation, and so the impacts are still there. If the mitigation's failing, there ought to be another way to get back into the game and get these fixed. and redone.
To Mr. Cho next.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this mitigation packages are like the least we can do. And to make sure that they're effective and they're working is incredibly important. I think that not only do we need to revisit some of the ones that have been installed 30, 40 years ago, but we need to require that feature homes built in this area have them, and then we need to expand the fence, right, so that the radius within the airport that falls under the qualifications for receiving the mitigation package is expanded, right, and to include areas like Beacon Hill and Vashon and whatnot.
Okay, Mr. Jacobson.
Well, again, I take it back to that economic expression, which is internalize the externalities, which means that the airport needs to be paying for these things. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that, and there's lots of challenges to make that happen. But I think, given the pain that it creates, the answer is we need to do it.
To the crowd.
Hi, I'm Harry Steinmetz, other than Des Moines, and I appreciate everything that's been said here tonight, and I think that you've done a nice job of trying to address the quality of life and mitigation issues and things like that. But I think once you're elected, assuming that you are, you're going to find yourself under enormous pressure. You have a staff and a culture that simply is in opposite of what you're talking about. They believe in growth, 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 growth. You're going to run into pressure from enormous corporations, Alaska Airlines, Boeing, Delta, several other corporations that want to keep growing because this is doing them. What can you do to convince us that you have enough steel in your spine to actually take this on and deliver on what you're talking about tonight? From a personal level, if you have a story or something, I'd like to know about it.
Okay, let's give this 60 seconds, and let's start with Mr. Jacobson.
In 60 seconds or less, how do you enforce the items that are being expressed here? I would say, it comes to the core values that you yourself have, where you're willing to compromise, where you're not willing to compromise. It's extremely difficult when you're pressured from many different sides, but I think that you start by saying, okay, you come into a room like this and you really spend time with people to get an idea. Now, obviously, there is an immense amount of pressure to grow development. I recognize the economic pressures, but there is a compromise in between that can be met, and I believe that can be done. Now, will I do it? Yes, I will. I make commitments and I follow along.
Okay, let's go to Grant next.
So pick up the phone and call the city manager of the city of Bellevue or any of their staff that were there when I was mayor and on the council, and you will find that if your question is, can you stand up to the staff? I think you'll find very quickly that I did not only stand up to them, I gave them good direction. And one of the greatest compliments I ever got was when our public works director retired. He was a utilities director. He said, you were tough on us, but you made us better. And that's what I'll do.
And Sam.
Well, I think that when it comes to not buckling under the pressure or being swayed, it starts with not being beholden to them. And so I will say that I'm the only candidate in my race who has not taken money from the airlines or any corporations related to the port. And so I really don't care to start. But I will also say that it takes structural change, which is why I'm talking about things like reforming how the port race is done, district to the port, but also adding staff to the port commissioner role so that they can keep those senior executives accountable to the things that they need to be doing.
Okay. Back to the crowd. Yeah, 30 seconds.
Oh, I happen to be one of the people that does not believe that growth is inevitable. I think the growth. Yeah,
it's on.
Yeah, put it right up to your lips.
I think the growth comes because people are actively pushing the growth of the airlines. Half the mail I get in the mailbox is for go to this place, fly to this place, fly to that place. Everybody thinks now, oh, and the airlines are pushing cheap flights. They're not at all paying for what, I'm not used to the microphone. They're not at all used to, people are paying, airlines are pushing cheap flights, which encourages more people to fly. And I think it could be changed. It's just, to me, it's like the cigarette smoking was so popular, cigarette companies were pushing it until people realized it was harming them. And I don't think people know that flying is harming them, either personally for living under the flight path or globally through climate change. And I think that could change if people are more educated. So I have a question that somebody asked me to ask. And this is, considering that India just signed a $10 billion contract to build Hyperloop, and Missouri is now negotiating with a Hyperloop company, would you support a conference here about Hyperloop?
Let's start with you, Mr. Jacobson.
Well, I guess my short answer is I'm not very familiar with the technology, but I do think that we need to explore alternatives to airlines and flying. You know, as much as I recognize the economics of it all, I think that we've got to come up with different ways to do things. And I must say, tomorrow morning I'll be getting on the train going to Portland and not flying down there. And my wife is yelling at me now because I'm not at this wedding that I'm supposed to be at. So I will be there riding the train tomorrow.
Okay, Sam next.
I know exactly who asked that question, and I support their Hyperloop. I talked extensively about the Hyperloop. I'm a huge Elon Musk fan. I think the Hyperloop should probably start at Vancouver, British Columbia, and go all the way to Portland at the very least. And it would be awesome to be able to get between Portland and Vancouver within 45 minutes. That sounds like a dream. And that would also reduce the amount of trucks, vans, and flights between those three cities. And so I vehemently support that.
Great. Sure. I'll take one quickly. Third runway usage. There's widespread belief that there were original comments to use the third runway only during periods of bad weather. Estimates of usage at that time ranged between 20 and 30%. Now that third runway, just in the last 2 years, has been switched to 100% full-time usage. According to the port's own consultant, this has led to more than doubling of the usage since 2013. What would you say to the communities now suffering from this change in frequency? And let's start with Sam.
So the reason third runway is such a big deal is because it's actually the closest runway to the residential areas. And so one of the things that I've talked to Rep. Luciani about is putting a curfew on the third runway for cargo flights. And that's something that I support. I think it's something we should really promote as commissioners. And it's something that I believe is in discussions, but it's something that I would definitely push for.
Okay. Mr. Jacobson next.
I guess what I would say is the reason I'm running is because of my frustration with the airport and the type of things that are kind of a bait and switch sort of thing. And I agree, you got to curb those problems, or they may have created the situation where it's, you create the requirement of having to do it because of demand. But my quick answer is I think you have to figure out a way to bring back the original parameters that were established.
Okay. Grant.
So the port sent out a press release last Thursday, a week ago, saying that they had executed a new runway use agreement that would curtail the use of the third runway after midnight, so they better gosh darn well be doing that.
No, it's not out. I can tell you that right now.
To the crowd.
I want to thank you guys for coming. It's been very informative, and for Quiet Skies and whoever put this wonderful sheet together, everybody should get one before they leave. I live below the third runway. Real quickly as you leave tonight, look at the flight path. They're lined up like donuts coming in. It's ridiculous. On this sheet, it says Dallas Fort Worth operations has 7 runways over 17,000 acres. We have 2,500 acres with only 3 runways. Only one of you tonight, Sam, mentioned moving cargo to Moses Lake. Do you guys support the creation of a second airport? We need a second airport. This is insane, and that is one of the solutions.
Let's start here with Garth first.
Well, the question you raise is, yes, I would support a second airport, but I think the reality is that where do you put it, and which group of people do you get to impact by doing that? So what you have to do is start looking at what are the alternatives. Obviously, Payne Field, I would amp up flights to Payne Field as a way to reduce some of the traffic here. One of the things that could be explored would be maybe take the McCord Airfield and turn that into a second airport and move the military operations to Moses Lake, or do something of that. I mean, it's going to take some real creativity.
Mr. Deginger.
Yeah, I support the state legislature appointed a commission to start looking at that. We've got to do it because the air corridor is getting congested, and these are long lead time projects, so you need to plan it well in advance. In terms of cargo at Moses Lake, the Joint Transportation Committee of the legislature studied that last year, and it didn't find that Moses Lake was going to be a very productive alternative. We probably need to look at cargo alternatives up and down of the I-5 corridor, though.
Okay. Mr. Cho.
So expanding flights at Payne Field or JBLM is only spreading the problem for those communities in those areas. You know, if you ever go to the major airports, international airports like London Heathrow or Incheon Airport or Hong Kong, their airports are really far away from the city, and you take a bullet train into the city. That's what I want. The reason I talk about Moses Lake is because it's far enough where it doesn't impact huge communities, but if we build the infrastructure like a railway between the Moses Lake and the city of Seattle, people can commute via bullet train in, and it would solve a lot of the problems.
Keep it with the crowd.
Thank you. Mine's pretty quick. How the first part and the biggest sentence of the mission, which I know you know, but how can you support that with everything you've heard tonight? And so I'm curious. Commissioners shall serve the public in the mission of the Port of Seattle as a public agency to create quality jobs throughout the diverse communities of King County by advancing trade and commerce, promoting industrial growth, and stimulating economic development. Thank you.
Mr. Deginger, you're up first.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch your question. I heard what you read, but I didn't hear the question.
Reconcile the description of your job versus what we're here for.
What we're here for is part of our job, and that's at the end of the day. The port has significant missions in terms of economic development. That's why ports were created. But that doesn't mean it's the only mission. And when you are providing a service and a series of services, you also have to mitigate the impacts of those services. And that's why we're here tonight, talking about how we can do better. And I think we can do better. And that's why I'm running.
Mr. Cho next.
So I think the mission statement that you read is an outdated one. Last week, the Port of Seattle met and they revised the mission statement, and they separated economic growth part and quality of life. Quality of life is actually now part of the mission statement. As a Port Commissioner, my goal will be to emphasize the quality of life portion of the mission statement.
Mr. Jacobson.
I take a different look at it. In my day job, I'm involved with lots of business entities, and one of those business entities, what they call a B Corp, it's still a corporation, still there to make money and do things, but it also includes the other aspects of improving quality of life for the people that involved with the entity and the community too. And I don't see any reason why there has to be some sort of belief that it's the exclusive desire of the port to go in those directions. So I would say that the mission statement either needs to be changed or look at the inclusiveness and more.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, oh, I'm supposed to turn it on, but I do speak loud. So, my name is Sheila Brush, and I actually sit on the start. And even though I have a question, I need to clarify some things because I think you're getting a lot of your information from Port news releases and propaganda because you're very much misinformed. So you just referenced the runway use agreement. In the start working groups behind closed doors because they're not all open to the public, and the Port of Seattle will not audio or videotape them even though we've requested numerous times. The discussions were, this runways use agreement means nothing because they're already doing it. Response, because the pilots already do it. No pilot is going to land on the third runway when 2 and 1 is open because of the fuel to get across to the gates. They're already doing this. And if we had full transparency from the Port of Seattle, you would have heard the discussion. You would have heard a former city manager say, yes, they are, but the public doesn't know that, so let's just use it as a win. That's what you would have heard, the truth. But what you're hearing is that there's some magical runway use agreement that's going to change everything for us. It means nothing. The other thing that was brought up at the beginning, and it's in reference to START, is the late time limitation program. You're very misinformed on that. The late time mitigation program, again, means nothing because behind closed doors with citizens, but the public is not allowed to attend. What was discussed was not 12 to 5, but 11 to 6:30, and that they actually moved those flight paths over I-5, over Pack Highway, and out towards the water. The FAA said no. Came back to us in another working group, and the people in the working group caved because that's as good as we're going to get, just 12 to 5. We will not see any reductions. So I urge you all to not believe what the port puts out. I urge you all, of whoever becomes port commissioner, that you make audio and videotaping, recording of such working groups mandatory because they won't allow it. And why? Because omission is a lie, and there's omitting, and there's flat out lying going on behind closed doors from the Port of Seattle staff. My question, though, is, I'm sure you all watched the presidential candidate debates, and a hot topic was environmental justice. Have any of you looked at the environmental justice going on in our area? Have you ever examined, for instance, the port mitigation packages and asked yourself why they haven't done any apartment buildings? Even though many of those apartment buildings are full of the less fortunate due to social economical, from other countries, and yet those communities, those residents, have yet to get the port package. Have you asked yourself why in all those years the people that are most exposed to the impacts of the operations at sea-tac still haven't had apartment buildings mitigated?
Let's start here with Mr. Jacobson.
Well, I can't answer why they haven't done that. I would say that you raised an important point, but I think before you got to your question, there was something that stuck with me, and that is the information that's put out by the port. For example, they talk about all these great advances and developments within the airport, and they say it's all from revenues from the port. But port operations, but the truth of the matter is it's taxes. Everybody is taxed on their airline tickets, and there's all sorts of other sort of hidden fees and things that all relate to the taxes. So I wish there would be honesty and just say, look, we're taxing everybody for all this, and you're paying for it. And so I think that I agree with you. There's got to be straightforward transparency and honesty. Because it bothers me. I came from a state of Montana, 20 plus years ago, where one of the requirements was everything had to be open meetings. There was no such thing as closed meetings. So I would strongly move that direction.
Mr. Cho, next.
So, when it comes to mitigation packages, I've definitely had a lot of conversations within this community about where it has fallen short. Apartment buildings, actually, I'll be honest, first time that this has come up, and I would love to talk to you more about it. But when it comes to things like environmental justice, I've spent my entire career fighting for environmental justice as a person of color, as someone who comes from a community that's disproportionately impacted by a lot of the things that are happening in King County. I can say that, you know, when I worked in the state legislature for Senator Bob Hazagawa, we have fought for justice, social justice, racial justice, environmental justice on every level. And, you know, I will commit to you today that as a Port Commissioner, I will make sure that that justice is served.
Okay. Mr. Deginger.
So if you take anything from what I've said tonight, I think I made it pretty clear. I think the mitigation program is falling way short. I'm glad you brought up the apartment situation because I haven't zeroed in on that, but I will. We need to do better. I keep saying this because I believe it. We gotta do better. When we're talking about the kind of investments that are being talked about at the airport, there needs to be a significant amount of investment in mitigation here. And given the dollars that we're talking about, the dollars for mitigation need to go up substantially.
So, and I could just yell my follow-up. It was actually the glide slope. I said the late night limitation program. It's actually the glide slope, and I just think people need to hear, and you need to hear, and I'll send you the documents. It was never about the glide slope. The glide slope is at 2.75 for arrivals only on the first runway. It was never about the glide slope. Behind closed doors, what it was about is on the port's own website, and in every meeting, they stood by a 3-degree glide slope. Even though when you went back, and I'm going from memory, and it could be 1996, it could be 2001, I'm not quite sure. When you go back into records request, they got an exemption from the FAA to have it at 2.75. When you do records requests and you see conversations with Stan Shepard and his staff, and they say, should we tell them it's 2.75 because we know. We're in those meetings and we know. And they say, God, no, don't open that can of worms. And then they put out a press release that they somehow are going to raise it to relieve the communities. They are not doing that. They have to move the antenna because it was put in the wrong place all those years ago. The FAA knew about it, the port knew about it. They didn't have the money to move it, but they're moving it now only for the SAM. But they're making it a win for the community. And that is the type of behavior that has to stop. It is immoral, it is injustice, and and I don't know how people can look at themselves in the face when they sit in a meeting, a closed-door meeting that is not audio or videotaped, and tell us bold-faced lies, then go back and have internal emails where they're admitting to those lies, and then they have Perry Cooper putting out a press release that they're giving something to the community. So I hope whoever is elected on this panel, because one of you, two of you, might be, will be, I hope you take a hard look at the culture of the staff of the Port of Seattle, because that is where the change needs to happen.
Enough time for one more question. I invite the constituents and the candidates to both be succinct.
So I heard, hi, I'm Debbie Wagner. I heard one of the candidates mention that the port has taken climate to heart and is one of the most aggressive, has one of the most aggressive programs in the U.S. So it's another really good example of being fed some propaganda. I sat on the Port of Seattle's Energy and Sustainability Committee for a year. I was invited to that by Fred Kellerman, and I learned that the port emissions of CO2, which is just one of the climate change emissions in a whole range of emissions, is rivaling a coal-fired power plant at this point. It's double the largest refinery in Washington, and it's 90% from jets. So 90% of their inventory problem on climate emissions is coming from jets. What they've done is said we can't do anything about the jets, so we're going to focus on the other 10%. And their goal is to reduce the 10% by 3% per year. So when you're increasing the 90% by 10% per year and ignoring it, but decreasing the 10% by 3% per year, and only reporting that part of it, it looks like a very aggressive, wonderful program, but it's really crap. So, again, you're listening to port propaganda, not doing your homework, not knowing what the emission loads really are. In 1997, when the FAA approved the third runway, they had emission problems, not just as climate change, that wasn't a big deal back then, but They had criteria pollutants that were violating the Clean Air Act. They committed with EPA to monitor emissions after 2010 because their EIS predicted they would have more violations after 2010. They are not interested in looking at any of that. We haven't had any monitoring for air quality impacts around the airport, ever. No robust monitoring, and no regional monitors are anywhere near here. Would you commit to a monitoring program around the airport for air toxics and criteria pollutants?
Okay, 30 seconds. Let's start with Mr. Jacobson, please.
Well, it sounds like a good idea to me. I certainly want to know more about it, but I think you got to be able to understand where the problems lie before you start figuring out the solutions. But monitoring is a good way to start. There's so much more I could say about what you described, but I would start with saying, yes, I agree they should be monitoring.
So I would say that if it's a not, my understanding is there has to be some monitoring by the PG Center and Control Administration. So the question then becomes, need there be more? And the answer is maybe there does need to be more. I need to learn more about it because of the history here. What I would also say is, in light of the fact that there are particulate studies going on and there's some additional studies going on now, adding more to it may well be viable, but I would like to learn more about it.
Mr. Cho.
I mean, I'll be short, yes. The answer is yes, we need to increase monitoring, but we also, again, need to increase the radius within which we do the monitoring, because clearly this is not affecting just the people who live in this area, but also Vashon, Beacon Hill. You go up to Beacon Hill and they're being affected by that too. Payne Field as well, because now there's more flights coming out of Payne Field. So the radius of that monitoring needs to be expanded.
Right. Turn things back over to Steve Edmondson.
So we just need to be, I know we started late because we wanted people to have a chance to show up, but we still need to be respectful of time. People have committed to be here till 8 o'clock, and we've stayed a few minutes afterwards. And I guess I would just like to say this. First, I hope you will join me in thanking Mr. Cho, Mr. Jacobson, and Mr. Deginger for spending 2 hours, because they were here on time. And yes, thank you. And in any good forum, you're going to hear things you agree with and things you disagree with and things you're going to scratch your head about. But we just got 2 hours of Q&A on a lot of subjects that are near and dear to us. And I'm sure all of these gentlemen would be happy later on an email or a call, and they want to hear from you, and they'll want follow-up. And if you didn't get what you wanted in terms of your question, I'm sure there will be a dialogue afterwards, and I'm sure all these gentlemen would say that's fine. So thank you all, gentlemen. And now I want to say thank you to, sometimes being a great referee means you are invisible and people don't remember that you were there. I think you managed to do both. We're not going to forget that you were here, Blake Messer, but you did a great job facilitating. I really appreciate it. Let's give Blake a hand. And then finally, there are a number of organizations represented here, many of which coalesce to become this infant thing. Infancy. First time around, just getting our feet wet. The League of Quiet Skies Voters. I think this can become something special, much larger than just our tiny little region and our single airport. So let's just applaud ourselves, or if you're not ourselves and you're yourselves, just co-applaud, make everybody feel good about that. It was a good thing that we did this, and thank you again, everyone, for being here.